Today we're taking a look at something a bit different. Since it is the Christmas season, I thought it would be fun to take a look at an event that happened on Christmas. And my first idea was to make a video about the Christmas truce of World War I. But I thought that event is rather well known by now, or at least I believe that it's rather well known in comparison to the event which I decided on. The event which I decided on is the coronation of Charlemagne as Emperor of the Romans. But before we take a look at the coronation itself, it would be a good idea to find out who this Charlemagne even was and why it is an important event of history. So, let's start with his birth. Charlemagne, coming from the French word for Charles the Great, or Karl der Große in German, was most likely born on April the 2nd, 747, according to the reconstruction of the life of his parents and himself. But the 100% true birthday is unknown. Also unknown is the exact place of birth, although the most likely places are either Aachen in modern-day Germany or Liège in present-day Belgium, but other locations have been suggested, such as Düren, Gauting, Mürlenbach, Kürzey or Prüm. However, as stated, there is no definitive evidence to resolve this question. Now, for the circumstances of his birth. Charlemagne was the eldest child of Pepin the Short and his wife Bertrada of Laon. Many historians, however, consider Charlemagne to have been illegitimate, although some state that this is arguable because Pepin did not marry Bertrada until 744, which was after Charles' birth. Now, let's look at how Charlemagne even became a king. According to the life, Pepin died in Paris on the 24th of September 768, whereupon the kingship passed jointly to his sons with divine assent or divino nuto in Latin. The Franks, in General Assembly or Generali Conventu in Latin, gave them both the rank of a king, reges, but partitioned the whole body of the kingdom equally, totum regni corpus ex equo partirentum. The annals tell a slightly different version, with the king dying at St. Denis near Paris. The two lords, domni, were elevated to kingship, elevatissan in regnum, Charles on the 9th of October in Noyon, Carloman on an unspecified date in Soissons. If born in 742, Charles was 26 years old, but he had been campaigning at his father's right hand for several years, which may help to account for his military skill. His brother Carloman was 17. The language in either case suggests that there were no two inheritances, which would have created distinct kings ruling over distinct kingdoms, but a single joint inheritance and a joint kingship tenated by two equal kings. Charles and his brother Carloman, as before, were rewarded distinct jurisdictions. Charles received Pepin's original share as mayor, the outer parts of the kingdom bordering on the sea, namely Neustria, western Aquitaine, and the northern parts of Austrasia, while Carloman was awarded his uncle's former share, the inner parts, southern Austrasia, Septimania, eastern Aquitaine, Burgundy, Provence, and Swabia, lands bordering Italy. The question of whether these jurisdictions were joint shares reverting to the other brother if one brother died, or were inherited property passed on to the descendants of the brother who died, was never definitively settled. Now let us take a step back and go a bit back in time and take a look at a few of the achievements that Charlemagne did have before becoming emperor. Starting with the Saracens, who crossed the mountains to claim Ardo Septimia, only to encounter the Basque dynasty of Aquitaine, always the allies of the Goths. Odo the Great of Aquitaine was at first victorious at the Battle of Toulouse in 721. Saracen troops gradually massed in Septimania, and in 732 an army under Emir Abdul Rahman al-Ghafiqi advanced into Vasconia, and Odo was defeated at the Battle of the River Garonne. They took Bordeaux and were advancing towards Tours when Odo, powerless to stop them, appealed to his arch-enemy Charles Martel, the mayor of the Franks. In one of the first of the lightning marches for which the Carolingian kings became famous, Charles and his army appeared in the path of the Saracens between Tours and Poitiers, and in the Battle of Tours decisively defeated and killed al-Ghafiqi. The Moors returned twice more, each time suffering defeat at Charles' hands. At the river Beret near Narbonne in 737 and in the Dauphiné in 740. Odo's price for salvation from the Saracens was incorporation into the Frankish kingdom, a decision that was repugnant to him and also to his heirs. After the death of his father, Hunald I allied himself with Free Lombardy. However, Odo had ambiguously left the kingdom jointly to his two sons, Hunald and Hatto. The latter, loyal to Francia, now went to war with his brother over full possession. Victorious, Hunald blinded and imprisoned his brother, only to be so stricken by conscience that he resigned and entered the church as a monk to do penance. The story is told in Annales Metanese Piors. His son Wafer took an early inheritance, becoming Duke of Aquitaine and ratifying the alliance with Lombardy. Wafer, deciding to honor it, repeated his father's decision, which he justified by arguing that any agreements with Charles Martel became invalid on Martel's death, since Aquitaine was now Pepin's inheritance because of the earlier assistance given by Charles Martel. According to some, the latter and his son, the young Charles, hunted down Wafer, who could only conduct a guerrilla war, and executed him. Among the contingents of the Frankish army were Bavarians under Tassilo III, Duke of Bavaria, and Agilolfing, the hereditary Bavarian ducal family. Griffo had installed himself as Duke of Bavaria, but Pepin replaced him with a member of the ducal family, yet a child, Tassilo, whose protector he had become after the death of his father. The loyalty of Agilolfings was perpetually in question, but Pepin exacted numerous oaths of loyalty from Tassilo. However, the latter had married Liutperga, a daughter of the Cedarius, king of Lombardy. At a critical point in the campaign, Tassilo left the field with all his Bavarians. Out of reach of Pepin, he repudiated all loyalty to Francia. Pepin had no chance to respond as he grew ill and died within a few weeks after Wafer's execution. The first event of the brothers' reign was the uprising of Aquitaine and Gascons in 769. and their territory split between two kings. 1 year earlier, Pepin had finally defeated Waifer, Duke of Aquitaine, after waging a destructive 10-year war against Aquitaine. Now, Hunald II led the Aquitaines as far north as Angoulême. Charles met Carloman, but Carloman refused to participate and returned to Burgundy. Charles alone went to war, leading an army to Bordeaux, where he built a fortified camp on the mount at Fronsac. Hunald was forced to flee to the court of Duke Lupus II of Gascony. Lupus, fearing Charles, turned Hunald over in exchange for peace, and Hunald was put in a monastery. The lords of Gascon also surrendered, and Aquitaine and Gascony were finally fully subdued by the Franks. The brothers maintained lukewarm relations with the assistance of their mother Bertrada, but in 1770 Charles signed a treaty with Duke Tassilo III of Bavaria and married a Lombard princess, commonly known today as Desiderata, the daughter of King Desiderius. He did this to surround Carloman, his brother, with his own allies. Though Pope Stephen III first opposed the marriage with the Lombard princess, he found little to fear from a Frankish-Lombard alliance. Less than a year after his marriage, Charlemagne repudiated Desiderata and married a 13-year-old Swabian named Hildegard. The repudiated Desiderata returned to her father's court at Pavia. Her father's wrath was now aroused, and he would have gladly allied with Carloman to defeat Charles. Before any open hostilities could be declared, however, Carloman died on the 5th of December 771, apparently of natural causes. Carloman's widow Gerberga fled to Desiderius' court with her sons for protection. At his succession in 772, Pope Adrian I demanded the return of certain cities in the former Excorate of Ravenna in accordance with a promise at the succession of Desiderius. Instead, Desiderius took over certain papal cities and invaded the Pentapolis, heading for Rome. Adrian sent ambassadors to Charlemagne in autumn, requesting he enforce the policies of his father Pepin. Desiderius sent his own ambassadors, denying the Pope's charges. The ambassadors met at Thionville, and Charlemagne upheld the Pope's side. Charlemagne demanded what the Pope had requested, but Desiderius swore never to comply. Charlemagne and his uncle Bernard crossed the Alps in 773 and chased the Lombards back to Pavia, which they then besieged. Charlemagne temporarily left the siege to deal with Adelchis, son of Desiderius, who was raising an army at Verona. The young prince was chased to the Adriatic littoral and fled to Constantinople to plead for assistance from Constantine V, who was waging war with Bulgaria. The siege lasted until the spring of 774, when Charlemagne visited the Pope in Rome. There he confirmed his father's grants of land, with some later chronicles falsely claiming that he also expanded them, granting Tuscany, Emilia, Venice and Corsica. The Pope granted him the title Patrician. He then returned to Pavia, where the Lombards were on the verge of surrendering. In return for their lives, the Lombards surrendered and opened the gates in early summer. Desiderius was sent to the Abbey of Corby, and his son Adelchis died in Constantinople, a Partisan. Charles, unusually, had himself crowned with the Iron Crown and made the magnates of Lombardy pay homage to him at Pavia. Only Duke Achesius II of Benevento refused to submit and proclaimed independence. Charlemagne was then master of Italy as king of the Lombards. He left Italy with a garrison in Pavia and a few Frankish counts in place the same year. However, instability continued in Italy. In 776, Dukes Hordegaud of Friuli and Hildebrand of Spoleto rebelled. Charlemagne rushed back from Saxony and defeated the Duke of Friuli in battle. The Duke was slain, the Duke of Spoleto signed a treaty. Their co-conspirator Areches was not subdued, and Adelchis, their candidates in Byzantium, never left that city. Northern Italy was now faithfully his. In 787, Charlemagne directed his attention towards the Duchy of Benevento, where Areches II was reigning independently with the self-given title of Principe. Charlemagne's siege of Salerno forced Areches into submission. However, after Areches II's death in 787, his son Grimoald III proclaimed the Duchy of Benevento newly independent. Grimoald was attacked many times by Charles or his sons, without achieving a definitive victory. Charlemagne lost interest in the region and never again returned to southern Italy, where Grimoald was able to keep the duchy free from Frankish suzerainty. Charlemagne was engaged in almost constant warfare throughout his reign, often at the head of his elite Skara bodyguard squadrons. In the Saxon Wars, spanning 30 years and 18 battles, he conquered Saxonia and proceeded to convert it to Christianity. In 788, the Avars, an Asian nomadic group that had settled down in what is today Hungary, also called the Huns, invaded Friuli and Bavaria. Charlemagne was preoccupied with other matters until 790, when he marched down the Danube and ravaged Avar territory to the Gyr. A Lombard army under Pippin then marched into the Drava valley and ravaged Pannonia. The campaigns ended when the Saxons revolted again in 792. For the next 2 years Charlemagne was occupied, along with the Slavs, against the Saxons. Pippin and Duke Eric of Friuli continued, however, to assault the Avars' ring-shaped strongholds. The Great Ring of the Avars, their capital fortress, was taken twice. The booty was sent to Charlemagne at his capital Aachen and redistributed to his followers and to foreign rulers, including King Offa of Mercia. Soon the Avars students had lost the will to fight and traveled to Aachen to become vassals of Charlemagne and to become Christians. Charlemagne accepted their surrender and sent one native chief, baptized Abraham, back to Bavaria with the ancient title of Kagan. Abraham kept his people in line, but in 800 the Bulgarians under Khan Krum attacked the remains of the Avar state. In 803 Charlemagne sent a Bavarian army into Pannonia, defeating and bringing an end to the Avar Confederation. In November of the same year Charlemagne went to Regensburg, where the Avar leaders acknowledged him as their ruler. In 805 the Avar Kagan, who had already been baptized, went to Aachen to ask permission to settle with his people southeastward from Vienna. The Trans-Danubian territories became integral parts of the Frankish realm, which was abolished by the Magyars in 899 to 900. In 789, in recognition of his new pagan neighbors, the Slavs, Charlemagne marched an Austrasian Saxon army across the Elbe into Obotrite territory. The Slavs ultimately submitted, led by their leader Witzin. Charlemagne then accepted their surrender of the Veleti under Dragovit and demanded many hostages. He also demanded permission to send missionaries into this pagan region unmolested. The army marched to the Baltic before turning around and marching to the Rhine, winning much booty with no harassment. The tributary Slavs became loyal allies. In 795, when the Saxons broke the peace, the Aborites and Velvety rebelled with their new ruler against the Saxons. Witzin died in battle, and Charlemagne avenged him by harrying the Estphalians on the Elbe. Truscuco, his successor, led his men to conquest over the Nordalbingians and handed their leaders over to Charlemagne, who honored him. The Aborites remained loyal until Charles' death and fought later against the Danes. When Charlemagne incorporated much of Central Europe, he brought the Frankish state face to face with the Avars and Slavs in the southeast. The most southeast Frankish neighbor were Croats, who settled in Lower Pannonia and the Duchy of Croatia. While fighting the Avars, the Franks had called for their support during the 790s. He won a major victory over them in 796. Duke Wionomir of Lower Pannonia aided Charlemagne and the Franks, made himself overlord of the Croats of northern Dalmatia, Slavonia and Pannonia. The Frankish commander Eric of Friuli wanted to extend his domain by conquering the littoral Croat duchy. During that time, Dalmatian Croatia was ruled by the Duke Vízislav of Croatia. In the Battle of Zrat, the forces of Eric fled their position and were routed by the forces of Vízislav. Eric was among those killed, which was a great blow for the Carolingian army. In 799, Pope Leo III had been assaulted by some of the Romans, who tried to put out his eyes and tear out his tongue. Leo escaped and fled to Charlemagne at Paderborn. Charlemagne, advised by scholar Alcuin, traveled to Rome in November 800 and held a synod. On the 23rd of December, Leo swore an oath of innocence to Charlemagne. His position having thereby been weakened, the Pope sought to restore his status. 2 days later at Mass on Christmas Day, the 25th of December, when Charlemagne knelt at the altar to pray, the Pope crowned him Imperator Romanorum, or Emperor of the Romans, in St. Peter's Basilica. In doing so, the Pope rejected the legitimacy of Empress Irene of Constantinople. Charlemagne also directed his attention to the Slavs to the west of the Avar Khaganate, the Carinatians and Carinolans. These peoples subdued by the Lombards and Bavaria, and made tributaries, but were never fully incorporated into the Frankish state. When Odoacer compelled the abdication of Romulus Augustus, he did not abolish the Western Empire as a separate power, but caused it to be reunited with or sink into the Eastern, so that from that time there was a single undivided Roman Empire. Pope Leo III and Charlemagne, like their predecessors, held the Roman Empire to be one and indivisible, and proposed by the coronation of Charlemagne not to proclaim a severance of the East and West. They were not revolting against the reigning sovereign, but legitimately filling up the place of the deposed Constantine VI. Charlemagne was held to be the legitimate successor, not of Romulus Augustus, but of Constantine VI. Charlemagne's coronation as emperor, though intended to represent the continuation of the unbroken line of emperors from Augustus to Constantine VI, had the effect of setting up two separate, and often opposing, empires, and two separate claims to imperial authority. It led to war in 802 and for centuries to come. The emperors of both West and East would make competing claims of sovereignty over the whole. Einhard says that Charlemagne was ignorant of the Pope's intent and did not want any such coronation. He at first had such an aversion that he declared that he would not have set foot in the church that day were imperial titles conferred, although it was a great feast day, if he could have foreseen the design of the Pope. A number of modern scholars, however, suggest that Charlemagne was indeed aware of the coronation. Certainly he cannot have missed the bejeweled crown waiting on the altar where he came to pray, something even contemporary sources support. Historians have debated for centuries whether Charlemagne was aware before the coronation of the Pope's intention to crown him emperor. However, Charlemagne declared that he would not have entered St. Peter's had he known, according to chapter 28 of Einhard's Vital Carolinae Magni. But that debate obscured the more significant question of why the Pope granted the title and why Charlemagne accepted it. Collin points out that the motivation behind the acceptance of the imperial title was a romantic and antiquarian interest in reviving the Roman Empire is highly unlikely. For one thing, such romance would not have appealed either to Franks or Roman Catholics at the turn of the 9th century, both of whom viewed the classical heritage of the Roman Empire with distrust. The Franks took pride in having fought against and thrown from their shoulders the heavy yoke of the Romans, and from knowledge gained in baptism, clothed in gold and precious stones, the bodies of the holy martyrs whom the Romans had killed by fire, by the sword, and by wild animals, as Pepin III described it in a law of 763 or 764. Furthermore, the new title, carrying with it the risk that the new emperor would make drastic changes to the traditional styles and procedures of government, or concentrate his attention on Italy or on Mediterranean concerns more generally, risked alienating the Frankish leadership. For both the Pope and Charlemagne, the Roman Empire remained a significant power in European politics at this time. The Byzantine Empire, based in Constantinople, continued to hold a substantial portion of Italy, with borders not far south from Rome. Charles, sitting in judgment of the Pope, could be seen as usurping the prerogatives of the emperor in Constantinople. Charlemagne used these circumstances to claim that he was the renewer of the Roman Empire, which had declined under the Byzantines. In his official charters, Charles preferred the style Carolus Serenismus Augustus Adeo Coronatus Magnus Pacificus Imperator Romanum Gubernanus Imperium. Charles, the most serene Augustus, crowned by God the great peaceful emperor ruling the Roman Empire, to the more direct Imperator Romanum, Emperor of the Romans. The title of emperor remained in the Carolingian family for years to come, but divisions of territory and infighting over supremacy of the Frankish state weakened its significance. The papacy itself never forgot the title nor abandoned the right to bestow it. When the family of Charles ceased to produce worthy heirs, the Pope gladly crowned whichever Italian magnate could best protect him from his local enemies. The empire would remain in continuous existence for over a millennia as the Holy Roman Empire, a true imperial successor to Charles. In 813, Charlemagne called Louis the Pious, king of Aquitaine, his only surviving legitimate son, to his court. There, Charlemagne crowned his son as a co-emperor and sent him back to Aquitaine. He then spent the autumn hunting before returning to Aachen on November 1st. In January, he fell ill with pleurisy, in deep depression, mostly because many of his plans were not yet realized. He took to his bed on the 21st of January, and as Einhard tells it, he died January 28th, the 7th day from the time he took to his bed, at 9 o'clock in the morning, after partaking of the Holy Communion, in the 72nd year of his age and the 47th of his reign. He was buried that same day in Aachen Cathedral. The earliest surviving Planctus, the Planctus de Obito Caroli, was composed by the monk of Bobbio, which he had patronized. A later story told by Otto of Lomello, Count of the Palace at Aachen in the time of Emperor Otto III, would claim that he and Otto had discovered Charlemagne's tomb. Charlemagne, they claimed, was seated upon a throne wearing a crown and holding a scepter, his flesh almost entirely incorrupt. In 1165, Emperor Frederick I reopened the tomb again and placed the emperor in a sarcophagus beneath the floor of the cathedral. In 1215, Emperor Frederick II reinterred him in a casket made of gold and silver, known as the Karlsschrein. And with that, we have taken a look in a short breakdown of Charlemagne's life and his coronation on Christmas. I hope you enjoyed this video. If so, please like or subscribe. Both would mean a lot to me, and Merry Christmas everybody.